Welcome, everyone. This is the 25th Goodman Lecture presented by Kensei Foundation. My name is Trent Walker. I'm a member of Kensei Foundation Academic Development Committee. I'm also an assistant professor at the University of Michigan. Today, as you all know, we have a very exciting talk by Professor Georgios Halkias, a leading scholar of Buddhist studies right now at the University of Hong Kong. His lecture is titled Notes on the Earliest Tibetan Buddhist Canons. The Goodman Lectures, which are done in honor of and memory of Professor Stephen Goodman, a longtime friend and advisor to Kensei Foundation, is designed to build bridges between the academic study of Buddhism and general audiences who might be interested in Buddhist studies. So this lecture and all past talks are made freely available from Kensei Foundation's website and social media channels. So I invite you to check those out if you're interested in. As usual, for today's talk, like other talks in this series, we'll have a period of Q&A. As I mentioned just a few moments ago, to ask a question, please submit it to KF Q&A in the chat box, and then I'll have a chance to pose selected questions directly to our speaker. Speaking of our speaker, our distinguished guest today is Professor Georgios Halkias, who earned his doctorate from the University of Oxford in 2006 after years of study in philosophy, film, and Buddhist studies at Hawaii, the Netherlands, and in London. He's taught where he is now at the Center for Buddhist Studies at the University of Hong Kong since 2012, where he currently serves as director for the center. And along the way, he's garnered many fellowships and research grants, including from institutions in Belgium, Germany, Japan, the UK, and also in Hong Kong. Those of you that might know something about Professor Halkias' scholarship know that he is especially well known for his works on Pure Land Buddhism in Tibet. In fact, he's really perhaps the leading authority on this form of Buddhism within the Tibetan sphere. He's also, however, published extensively on a wide range of other topics in Buddhist studies, including on Indo-Greek Buddhist encounters, Buddhist kingship in Tibet, Buddhist manuscripts and canon formation, part of what we might be hearing about today in the Tibetan context, also on Tibetan Thangka paintings and contemporary Buddhist cinema. He's also an extraordinarily prolific editor. So in addition to several edited volumes in Buddhist studies and in other fields in Asian studies that are in print or in progress, he's also the co-editor of the Oxford Research Encyclopedia of Buddhism. This is really a landmark reference work for our field of Buddhist studies. And I've also heard really wonderful things about a textbook of classical Tibetan that he has been co-authoring with some colleagues. To me, what makes all of these publications all the more remarkable is that they were produced while teaching a full range of graduate and undergraduate courses in Buddhist studies at the University of Hong Kong, which to my eyes is one of the most vibrant academic study settings for the study of Buddhism today. And indeed, one of very few universities in Asia where one can pursue, say, the study of Tibetan Buddhism in an academic setting through an English language medium. During the past decade, Professor Halkias has supervised or examined a really quite remarkable number of PhD dissertations in Buddhist studies produced in this department. And in connection with the Center for Buddhist Studies at the University of Hong Kong, this is one of the places that Kensei Foundation has been very proud to be able to partner and support in some respects this center over the years. And we've been especially impressed with the accomplishments of Dr. Halkias and his colleagues. So without further ado, I'd like to ask you all to join me in welcoming Professor Halkias. Thank you so much for joining us and for giving us a chance to learn from you in your lecture today. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Trent, for your exceptionally gracious introduction. And I extend my appreciation to the Kensei Foundation for its invitation to participate in the esteemed Goodman Lecture Series. Today in my presentation, my aim is to acquaint you with the earliest Tibetan collections of translated Buddhist literature. It is regrettable that many of the Buddhist texts mentioned in these inventories have not endured the test of time. But we're fortunate to possess two imperial catalogues that preserve a captivating narrative of the first systematic introduction of Buddhism to Tibet. These catalogues provide invaluable insights into the nature of the scriptures imported and translated into Tibetan, as well as the methodologies employed for the organization and classification of texts. I will need to share my screen with you. 1 second. Okay, I hope it's so good.
It's fantastic. Thank you.
The Tibetan perspective on their history is often framed within the context of Buddhism and its introduction to Tibet. This occurred in two distinct phases. The first phase involved the initial propagation of Buddhist teachings during the reign of the Tibetan emperors, known as Temple, while the second phase coincided with the emergence of Tibetan institutional monasticism in the late 10th century, marking a revival of Buddhism. In my presentation today, my focus will be mainly on the earliest dissemination of Buddhism, which is universally attributed during the reign of Somsen Gampo, the first Tibetan emperor. During the early 7th century, Somsen Gampo successfully united various Tibetan clans, forming a formidable empire that extended its influence across Central Asia. Over the course of the next 2 centuries, Tibetans established control over the trade routes along the ancient Silk Road, as well as regions in Western China, Inner Asia, and Central Asia. Historical records from the Tang dynasty mention that Somsen Gampo dispatched envoys to the Tang emperor, seeking a matrimonial alliance and sending tributes. In 641, Emperor welcomed the Chinese princess Wenzheng to his court as bride, along with a retinue of Chinese scholars and bureaucrats. Furthermore, 7 years later, Somsen Gampo requested skilled craftsmen from China to manufacture paper and ink for administrative purposes in his newly established empire. The Chinese emperor granted his request, serving as evidence that writing was indeed practiced during the reign of Somsen Gampo. The availability of paper and ink, along with the presence of Indian and Chinese Buddhist texts within the Tibetan court, likely served to reinforce the development of written communication for the imperial administration. The circulation of these texts within the court could have acted as a catalyst, encouraging the adoption and utilization of written language for administrative purposes. This in turn facilitated the organization and governance of the Tibetan Empire. The active promotion of Tibetan writing and the production of Buddhist literature stand as a compelling evidence of an early and intimate connection between Buddhism and imperial power in Tibet. The first documented dissemination of Buddhism coincides with the foundation and military expansion of the Tibetan Empire from the 7th to the 9th centuries. Although Tibetan encounters with Buddhism prior to the 7th century cannot be ruled out, according to traditional Tibetan accounts, the importation of Buddhism and first Tibetan translations of Buddhist literature commenced during the times of Somsen Gampo. We see him here depicted with Amitabha's head protruding above his own, an indication that he was considered an emanation of the Bodhisattva Avalokitesvara, the regent in Amitabha's Pure Land, Sukhavati. Post-imperial Tibetan sources inform us that Somsen Gampo's minister, Tonmi Sambota, devised the Tibetan alphabet on the model of the Western Gupta script, and authored 8 works on Tibetan grammar, of which only 2 are today extant, while the Chinese Tibetan translator teams concentrated on the translation of works on astrology and medicine. Tonmi and scholars from India, Nepal, and Kashmir worked on the translation of the first Buddhist sutras into Tibetan. The increasing political influence of the Tibetan Sangha and the need for a structured and standardized presentation of Buddhist teachings ultimately led to the official support of imperial catalogues, known as Karchag. These catalogues, based on earlier lists, comprised a revised selection primarily consisting of Sanskrit Buddhist literature translated into Tibetan, as well as some works authored by Tibetan writers of that time. During the 9th century, these proto-canonical inventories listed state-sponsored translations of Buddhist texts. They're arguably the earliest Buddhist canons in Tibet and serve, as we will see, as valuable historical records, shedding light on prevailing religious trends and political developments. Moreover, they provide insight into the diverse range of Indian, Chinese, and Central Asian Buddhist doctrines and practices that flourished during that time. Today, I will focus on the contents of one such catalogue, the Phangthangma catalogue, the Karchag Phangthangma, which was composed at the imperial court of Phang in the southern region of central Tibet. It is the last catalogue produced by imperial decree. An examination of its contents and divisions suggests that it was based on 2 earlier royal collections. The older of the 3 catalogues is known as the dkar inventory. It was also composed in the early 9th century at the fortress palace of Dkar and is commonly associated with the emperor Tridesongtsen Sanaleg. A copy of this catalogue is preserved in the Kangyur section of the Tibetan Buddhist Canon. The other catalogue, the Karchag Phangthangma, often referred to as the Middle Catalogue, is said to have been written during the reign of Tibetan Emperor Tridesongtsen at the court of Tsimpu. Unfortunately, it is considered currently missing. These catalogues and their contents provide us with valuable insights into the development of Buddhism in Tibet, its official acceptance, and the influence it had on the religious and political landscape of the time. The collaboration between skilled Tibetan translators, Lotsawas, and Buddhist scholars, Panditas, from India, China, and Central Asia is evident in 2 surviving imperial inventories, namely the Dkar and Phangthangma catalogues, which contain close to 1,000 texts. This remarkable intellectual cooperation resulted in the development of a new language, the sacred language of the Dharma. Translation projects were carried out with translation teams, working alongside numerous anonymous scribes. These scribes meticulously reviewed multiple versions of Buddhist scriptures, often encountering duplicate or triplicate versions of the same text. The exact number of variant recensions of the original manuscripts available to them, as well as their methods of collation, remain unknown. However, what we do know is that these catalogues drew on older inventories and that they reflect a gradual movement towards standardization. This movement aimed to regulate translations of Buddhist texts across the empire, culminating in what is known as the Great Revision. It was decreed by Tibetan emperors who sponsored the creation of lexica, dictionaries, and grammars to ensure uniformity in translations. It should be noted that Tibetan translators went beyond a passive reception of Indian Buddhist literature and pursued on their own the study of various aspects of Sanskrit grammar while composing their own Buddhist treatises. This is not surprising, for in Indian Buddhist cultures, the science of lexicography was traditionally regarded as one of the minor sciences, ancillary to the major science of grammar, and was considered to make up the complete cultural equipment of an educated person, modeling his career on that of a bodhisattva. In other words, lexicography and grammar, together with the other secular sciences, were in practice very often intimately bound up with Buddhist thought and civilization that was adapted and cultivated in Tibet. To summarize, these early translation endeavors contributed to the creation of an entirely new language, the Tibetan language of Dharma, which served for centuries up until the present day as a sacred language, containing the wisdom of the Buddha's teachings. This new language was governed by strict rules, regulated for the purpose of consistency and accuracy through the creation of dictionaries, grammars, and lexica. This extraordinary scholarly enterprise would not have been possible without the financial and legislative support of the Tibetan emperors. Wide-ranging lexicographical resources, bilingual dictionaries, and treatises dealing with the translation of Buddhist terms were a requisite for most translation work. 3 treatises, the so-called Vyutpati, were created by the best scholar translator teams in the early 9th century for the purpose of standardizing the methods of translation and setting Tibetan equivalents for Buddhist terminology. Well known among the treatises and preserved in the Tengyur is the Mahavyutpati, the large treatise of terms and expressions. It comprises a large collection of Sanskrit terms and expressions together with their Tibetan equivalents. This monumental work is arranged not alphabetically, but according to 283 subject rubrics or categories, covering a total of 9,565 entries. At about the same time as the Mahavyutpati, the Imperium commissioned another important resource for Tibetan translators, the Middle Treatise, better known in Tibetan as the Drajor Pamponipa. This work, also preserved in the Tengyur, provides information about a royal edict issued by the Tibetan ruler Tride Somtsen and the circumstances of its own composition. More importantly, this work enunciates important principles and guidelines for translators and provides clarification and justification for some of the terminology found in the Mahavyutpati. It features important grammatical and etymological explanations of Sanskrit terms and their Tibetan equivalents. There are many interesting and instructive conventions stipulated in the Middle Treatise. For example, when a word of the source language is polysemic, and if no word in the target language is available that covers all its possible meanings, then the word of the source language should be retained rather than translated into the target language. For example, the name Gautama cannot be readily translated into Tibetan because in Sanskrit, the root gao, go, has various meanings, which is impossible to render by any single translation equivalent. With these guidelines in place, Tibetan teams of Lotsawas and Panditas were invited to revise all existing translations of Buddhist texts, that is, purge them of errors and inconsistencies, according to an established religious terminology and principles fixed for the new language of translations. The official procedures for the standardization of language and the introduction of methodological guidelines were laid out in the 3 Vyutpati treatises composed prior to the Great Revision. Naturally, there are several instances where there is no regular and unique one-to-one correspondence between linguistic terms in the source language of Sanskrit and the Tibetan target language. We find several cases of variations in the rendering of technical terms and expressions of philosophical importance. For example, while Tibetan translators unanimously translated the polysemic word dharma as ch in Tibetan, this is not the case with the equally important term svabhava, which has been translated at times as rangsin and other times as no ni. While it is not possible to pinpoint a clear distinction between these two frequently occurring Tibetan equivalents. The study of the middle treatise is instructive. For example, we read how the emperor requested the preceptors from the West, specifically the Acharya Jinamitra, Surendrabodhi, Dhanasila, Bodhimitra, and the Tibetan preceptors Ratnaraksita, Dharmatasila, as well as the learned translators Nanasena, Jayaraksita, Manjushri Varman, Ratnadrasila, and others, to translate from Indic languages into Tibetan the terminologies of the great and small vehicles, that is to say, Sravakayana and Bodhisattvayana, to define the terms and make a written word list. The decree was issued that no one shall never deviate from this list and make it suitable for everybody to learn. In yet another passage from the Drajor Pamponipa, we read, with regard to the method of translating the good Dharma, as long as there is no contradiction to the meaning, then translate to the full advantage of Tibetan. When, in translating into Tibetan language without deviating from the arrangement of the Sanskrit, that is to say, without deviating from the Sanskrit syntax, thereby making the connection between expression and meaning well adapted to Tibetan, then translate without deviating from the arrangement of words in Sanskrit. If good Tibetan and intelligibility occur only by changing the Sanskrit syntax, in the case of a stanza of 4 or 6 verses, then change the order within the limits of a single stanza and translate to the full advantage of Tibetan, and having in view both the expression and the meaning. And in one last passage from the same lexicon, we read, when in translating the names of regions, sentient beings, flowers, fruits, etc., the translator hesitates about the exact meaning or whether the corresponding Tibetan expression is inadequate to that meaning. And even if, generally speaking, the possibility of translating it exists, but the translator does not know whether the meaning of the supposed term is adequate or not, it is better in this case to leave the Sanskrit expression and add at the head as an appellative the suitable common noun in Tibetan, such as yul or metok. Yul signifying a place and metok a flower. The above examples give us a taste on how the Drajor Pamponipa served as the Bible for Tibetan translators. 9th century Indian and Tibetan scholars responsible for establishing the methods of translating Buddhist texts offered guidelines for the principles determining both the formal structure of language, that is, the methods of the Indian grammatical tradition, and its interpretation. By 1814, the Emperor Tride Songtsen formalized 2 main ways of translation. The first is a convention-based translation that relies on the actual terms, and the second focuses on translation based on intention, focusing more on the meaning. The Phangthangma catalog, bound together with a copy of the Drajor Pamponipa, the middle treatise, was discovered in the 5th Dalai Lama's library at Drepung Monastery. Its publication in 2003 marked a significant and remarkable discovery. Previously believed to be lost, this imperial catalog stands for more than a document of Buddhist works officially translated during the empire. It is a historical testimony of the varieties of Indian Buddhism that were transmitted to Tibet in the 9th century, providing invaluable insights for Tibetologists and Indian Buddhist specialists. Together with the Dharma catalog, the Phangthangma catalog offers a definitive account of the official adaptation of Buddhism in the Tibetan Empire, therefore carrying great historical significance for the field of Tibetan Buddhist studies. The renowned 14th century polymath Goodman and other Tibetan compilers referred to these imperial inventories to establish the credibility of scriptures that eventually formed what is known today as the Tibetan Buddhist Canon. Many of the scriptural divisions and numerous texts listed in these early imperial catalogues have found their way into the Kangyur and Tengyur collections. According to one study, out of the 735 texts found in the Dhenkarma catalog, the majority of the first 445 texts were subsequently incorporated into the Kangyur, while the remaining texts, to the extent that they have survived, primarily became part of the Tengyur collection. Here we see a sample of the catalog that came down to us in the aforementioned publication in Ume script. In the catalog's introduction, we learned that the original manuscript contained captioned illustrations of prominent Buddhist masters, representing a lineage of Buddhist transmission to Tibet, starting, as expected, with the historical Buddha Sakyamuni. The illustrations were presented in the following order: the triad of Sakyamuni, Ananda, and Nagarjuna, followed in the background by a monk holding a parasol, Maitreya, Asanga, Vasubandhu, Dignaga, Dharmakirti, Santaraksita, Padmasambhava, Vimalamitra, Kamalasila, Hasan Mahayana, the seven Buddhas, Santigarbha, Buddha Guhya, Santideva, and Santrakirti. All these figures represent prominent Buddhist masters who played an important role in the Buddhist traditions of Tibet. Now let's turn our attention to the contents of the two surviving catalogs: the Phangthangma catalog, abbreviated PT here in the table, and the earlier catalog from Dhenkarma, abbreviated DK in our table. As we can see, the Phangthangma catalog contains 947 titles distributed across 32 divisions, while the Dhenkarma inventory lists 737 titles of Buddhist texts across 27 divisions. The catalogs share with each other 20 divisional headings and follow, for the most part, similar principles of organization. The titles of texts are sorted in relation to established doxographical schemes in Indian Buddhism. They are arranged according to vehicle, basket, school, and so forth. Texts are also arranged by size, the largest unit being a bampo, and the smallest a sloka. The majority of translations in both catalogs are predominantly that of Mahayana texts, divided into the Buddha speech, sutras, and commentaries, sastras. There are also a number of indigenous compositions which are listed under the heading of texts attributed to the Tibetan Emperor Trisong Detsen. In the Phangthangma catalog, the section dedicated to Mahayana sutras is divided into Prajnaparamita, Avatamsaka, Ratnakuta, Mahasutra, and other sutras classified according to size, vehicle, and Chinese origin. Out of more than 300 sutras listed in the inventory, less than 15 are singled out as translations from Chinese, and there's a noticeable decline in their number as compared to earlier listings in the Dhenkarma catalog. The section on Buddhist commentarial literature is apportioned into the divisions of Madhyamika, Yogacara, and Hinayana commentaries. Of particular interest is the division of indigenous Tibetan commentarial literature, titled Commentaries on Sutras and Sastras by Trisong Detsen and other Tibetan authors. The Madhyamika Lankara, also known as the Ornament of the Middle Way, is probably the first Madhyamika text to be translated into Tibetan. It is a short philosophical treatise attributed to the Indian Buddhist scholar monk Santaraksita. Santaraksita was an influential figure in the development of the Madhyamika Middle Way school of Mahayana Buddhism. In his text, he promotes a synthesis between the Madhyamika of Nagarjuna, the mind-only teachings of Asanga, and the logico-epistemological tradition of Dignaga and Dharmakirti. This great work, which marks the final stage in the evolution of Madhyamika, was the last major development of Buddhist philosophy in India. and was taken up by Santaraksita's disciples, most notably Kamalasila, whose name figures prominently in the so-called Samya debate. As we can see, there are 4 lengthy commentaries composed by unknown Tibetan masters and 1 long summary, 10 bampo long, by a Tibetan Buddhist scholar whose name is just given as Tashi. There are a total of 126 texts of Tibetan authorship, as compared to 7 listed in the older Tibetan catalog, the dkar. This is because, as we will discuss later, this catalog was open over the centuries to later emendations. Among these, only 18 are assigned to a named Tibetan author. Unfortunately, most of these early scriptures composed by Tibetan authors have not survived, including those composed by members of the imperial court. 3 of them here are historically significant. 1 work attributed to Queen Chengchugma, 1 small work attributed to King Emperor Murugtsen, and 1 work attributed to Emperor Badumten. Let's look at the first one. The work attributed to Queen Chengchugma, the Gyalmo Tsen of the Dro clan, is listed as one of the 5 queens of Tibetan Emperor Tridesomtsen. She was reportedly a follower of the Chinese monk Mahayana and present during the famous Samya debate between the Indian and Chinese Buddhist factions. According to history, after the death of her only son, she ordained, along with a maternal aunt of the king and 30 other noble ladies. She received the Buddhist name Jomo Chengchugma. From the catalog we read that she was the author of a Pranidhana, a monlam. The second work is attributed to Murugtsen, who was the brother of Emperor Tridesomtsen. He is mentioned in the imperial inscriptions, but according to some Tibetan sources, he was not given the chance to rule the empire because of having been banished to the northern frontier for murdering the son of a powerful minister sometime in the later 8th century. Even though his reign is not substantiated by early Tibetan sources, his designation as emperor, Murugtsen in the catalog, is in perfect agreement with the Tang annals, where it is said that the Chinese recognized him as an emperor under the name Chuchi Qian until his death in 1804. In this instance, the catalog record confirms the account given at Tang annals and not that of Tibetan historical sources. The most important discovery, perhaps, in the catalog is a work attributed to Emperor Badumten, better known as the infamous anti-Buddhist Emperor Langdharma. Emperor Langdharma was Sri Chuktetsen's successor and reputed assassin, and he was later assassinated, according to tradition, by the Buddhist monk Lalungpao Dorje in 1842. Later Tibetan traditions unanimously denigrate Langdharma as having been an anti-Buddhist king. As noted by other scholars and as attested in the catalog, the last Tibetan emperor may not have been entirely anti-Buddhist, but kept the Buddhist monasteries in less than a generous favor. According to the catalog, he issued a decree concerning an explanation of Madhyamika. The above examples illustrate how these early Tibetan catalogs are valuable historical sources that may serve to confirm our present knowledge of Tibetan history or clarify questions concerning historical personas. The circulation of tantric texts in Tibet was restricted by order of the imperial court, and permission to translate them and to transmit them was strictly controlled. It is against this background that the prominence of the imperial cult of Buddha Vairochana becomes significant. In the Phangthangma catalog, we find 6 Vajrayana texts related to Buddha Vairochana. The inclusion of tantric texts related to Vairochana substantiate a valuable iconographic evidence dating to the 9th century, in which we discern an association between Vairochana and the royal cult in Tibet, as further evidenced by numerous Tibetan prayers, found among the Tibetan manuscripts in Zhonghuang. Vairocana was seen as a representation of the imperial presence of the Tibetan emperor, known as the temple. The merging of deity and ruler was visually emphasized in the rock carvings of Buddha Vairocana and the 8 bodhisattvas found in Binda and Markham County in Tibet. These depictions showed Vairocana and the 8 bodhisattvas dressed in Tibetan royal attire, with ankle-length robes made of heavy fabric, adorned with overlong sleeves and a double collar. During my travels in Boom Valley, 20 kilometers south of Kegu town, the capital of Yushu district, I stumbled upon the Boom Vairocana temple, also built during the Tibetan Empire. An inscription at the backside of the courtyard of the temple is said to date to the times of the Tibetan Empire. This section that classifies 152 dharani according to size, kind, and as genera is a rich and informative category in the Phang catalog. There is a noticeable increase in the number of dharani as compared with the dkar catalog, which lists only 108. In our catalog, the Phangthangma, we discover an assortment of dharani that is telling of the Mahayana deities which transferred to Tibet in these early times. For example, we find the dharani dedicated to Avalokitesvara, Vajragarbha, Samantabhadra, Vajrapani, Vajrabhairava, Manjushri, the white canopy Ushnisha, and Amitayus, to mention some of the more well-known Buddhas and Bodhisattvas. We also find dharani associated with texts such as the Sutra of entering the city of Vaishali, the Stainless Sutra, and the Tathagata Sutra. Other dharani are widely varied and may include mantras for kings and queens, requests for the king of Nagas, mantras for increasing wealth and intelligence, dharani for bearing many children, and lastly, for curing illnesses, such as soothing hemorrhoids, eye diseases, and smallpox. Most dharani are of Indian origin, with 5 dharani designated as translations from Chinese, and 1 sutra with its related dharani from China and Bhutan. Despite the wealth of information and number of texts listed in the last imperial inventory, the catalog itself was not meant to be complete, but served also as a register for scriptures in the process of revision and inclusion. For example, if we turned our attention to Division 28, we read that there was a special category titled Scriptures of Sutras and Sastras in the Process of Revision and Remaining Translations. Here we find 24 texts apportioned under 3 subdivisions: unrevised sutras and commentaries on sutras, incomplete translations of sutra and Vinaya texts, and unrevised sastras. A most telling division for the cross-checking and cataloging enterprise is Division 29. The title of this section may roughly translate: a few titles of scriptures are listed in 3 registers. Many titles which are not available in 3 are generally accepted if they are listed in 2 registers. This division admits 33 texts distributed across 4 subdivisions. Titles acquired from 1 register, not listed in both registers. Titles acquired from Bande Zhonyun Ningpo's register, not listed in the 2 old registers. Titles of scriptures acquired in other colophons and in 1 old register, not listed in both old registers, and titles not listed in the colophons. This section and its subdivision sheds light to a complex editorial process. It appears that the editors of these catalogs compared titles across 2 older registers, which may have been the Dhenkarma and Simpoma catalogs. A 3rd inventory, used as a source for the Phangthangma catalog, was the catalog of the monk Zhonyun Ningpo, the 8th in a line of spiritual advisors, or Kalyana Mitras, in Samye Monastery. Generally speaking, those texts whose titles were represented in at least 2 older catalogs were selected for inclusion. It is clear that works listed in Division 29 are demarcated from the works in the rest of the catalog, which, by deduction, should have met the original criteria for cataloging set by the editors. That is to say, they were listed in at least 2 older registers. However, the selection process seems to have been yet more complex, for in addition to the registers, the editors availed themselves to the translators' colophons in the texts themselves, or, as mentioned, in the colophons of other texts. Bearing this in mind, the works that made it in the imperial catalogues reveal a process of scriptural appropriation and affirmation that entailed the intentional omission of other Buddhist texts and doctrines, thereby neither legitimized nor recorded. This was particularly true for texts not yet revised by the committees, or which were not listed in older catalogues. The most striking form of exclusion, however, concerns tantric texts. In the Madhya Vyutpatti, the middle treatise, composed in the 9th century, we read that 3 imperial decrees were issued. We have already briefly discussed the first decree concerning the norms governing Tibetan translations. The second decree prohibited the Tibetan translation of any Vinaya scriptures other than those belonging to the Mula Sarvastivada school. And the third imperial decree prohibited the translation of the Mother Tantras. Concerning the injunction against the translation of Tantric literature in Tibet, in the introduction to the Madhya Vyutpatti, we read that Emperor Tride Songtsen declared with regard to Dharanis and Tantras, except those that are suitable for being translated, mantras, tantras, and the words of mantras are powerful and are not permitted to be translated. The above passage confirms that the imperial catalogues were by no means exhaustive of all the early Buddhist literature translated into Tibetan. For example, most of the Nyingma texts found in the Nyingma Gyurbum, the collected tantras of the ancients, and in the London and Paris Don Juan collections are not represented in the imperial catalogues. In the 9th century, the Buddhist Council took up the question of the unsuitability of the tantras as a teaching for the Tibetans, and certain types of tantras, especially those of the mother class, were forbidden to be translated. Interestingly enough, a parallel development was observed in China with the prohibition of the translation of Anuttara Yoga Tantra type of texts and practices. So, that being said, it is rather curious to see 70 tantric texts listed in the Phangthangma catalog. This suggests that the catalog itself continued to be augmented following the collapse of the Tibetan Empire. This note, found in the margins of the catalog, informs us that the inner tantras were listed in catalogs other than these official inventories, which, as we have seen, are not exhaustive of all the texts translated during the times of the Tibetan Empire. How old is this note is not possible to tell, but the scribe was well aware that different catalogs were kept for the higher tantric teachings. The Karchag Phangthangma is the last authoritative witness of state-sponsored Buddhism in Tibet. Within this historical mosaic of interlaced issues concerning appropriation and affirmation of texts, spiritual lineage affiliations, and imperial interests, it has served for more than 500 years as the representative canon of early Buddhist literature in Tibetan translation. In the catalog's colophon and in a number of post-dynastic chronicles, we read that the catalog was compiled during the reign of Tritsuk Detsen. However, the inclusion of a Madhyamika text by Langdharma that we discussed earlier admits that the catalog was most likely composed during his reign and that of his heir, or that of his heir Osum. This makes sense if the Phangthangma is seen not as a fixed catalog following its compilation in the 9th century. A preliminary examination of available textual and iconographic evidence dealt elsewhere suggests that we are dealing with an open register, which, since it was the last of its kind, became susceptible to scriptural augmentation yielding from the second transmission of Buddhism onwards several variants. Based on the available evidence, it can be inferred that our manuscript, from which our current catalogue was copied, is a reproduction dating well after the 9th century. Internal evidence indicate that the source manuscript may be dated after the 14th century. This suggests that both the manuscript and its reproduction originate from the period when the scribe active during the 14th century was at work, according to the editor of our present edition. Further investigation is necessary to determine which texts in the catalogue belong to the second major translation of Buddhist literature into Tibetan in the late 10th century. The translation, cataloging, and dissemination of Buddhist scriptures were not simply scholarly endeavors, but also served to legitimize and consolidate the authority of the imperial administration. These efforts played a vital role in shaping the religious, cultural, and administrative landscape of Tibet during this formative period. The translation, reproduction, and distribution of Buddhist scriptures contributed to the dissemination of Buddhist teachings among the Tibetan populace, fostering a shared religious and cultural identity. This integration of Buddhism into the fabric of Tibetan society further strengthened the imperial administration and solidified the influence of Buddhism in the region. In this presentation, I have explored the potential for extracting significant religious, political, and doctrinal insights from the early catalogues of translated works. Specifically, we have examined the earliest records of Buddhist texts translated into Tibetan, shedding light on several noteworthy aspects. These have included the remarkable cross-cultural exchange between foreign scholars and Tibetan translators, the depiction of the Tibetan Empire as a fertile receptacle of Buddhism, and the deliberate oversight or suppression of religious texts and practices associated with lesser-known factions. I hope this brief introduction served as a window to the remarkable world of early Tibetan Buddhist literature and the process of translation of Buddhism in early Tibet. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you so very much, Professor Halkias, for such a clear and lucid and compelling lecture. So really appreciate your time in preparing that beautiful talk for us and for delivering it in such a clear way. So as all of you know, this is the time that we've set aside for discussion. Professor Halkias, if you'd like, oh, wonderful. I think we're
Yes.
both spotlighted now so everyone can see us. For any of you here in the audience that would like to ask a question to our speaker, again, you can type your question in the chat feature of Zoom to KF Q&A, and then I'll relay selected questions to Professor Halkias. While we're waiting for questions to come in, I hope you don't mind if I ask you a question or two of my own.
No, not at all, please.
So I wanted to come back to the middle treatise, or I have also a question about the Phangthangma catalog, but to come back to the middle treatise for a moment, and what you quoted from that, if I was understanding you correctly, was quite fascinating and something that I wasn't familiar with at all. And I'm curious about the kind of prescriptions given around how translation should be done. Say, in terms of the question of not changing the syntax or the word order from that of the Sanskrit when translating into Tibetan, unless it's necessary, and having a special kind of treatment for, say, polysemic words, etc. How accurate are these prescriptions with regards to what was actually translated during that period? In other words, were these prescriptions set forth in the middle treatise actually followed, or did they represent some kind of ideal that didn't actually get followed in all respects?
Mm-hmm. Thank you. That's a very good question. Well, certainly before the Great Revision, there seems to have been no consistent method of translating, and I think this is what prompted the Buddhist Council to come up with some regulations about translations, because it seems that its team of translators and panditas kind of gave their own translation of text. So what we see is that the emperor decided, this was by imperial, was legislated by 3 imperial decrees, that all past translations and all future translations have to follow the prescriptions of the Drajya Pampanipa, the middle treatise, and also the large treatise in terms of how to translate. And we do see a consistency. All of the works that were revised. Now, of course, we have works that weren't revised in Don Juan manuscripts, or so there are variations, but I think the ones that eventually made it into the Tibetan Buddhist canon more or less have gone through the process of great revision. So I would say they're pretty consistent.
Fantastic. Thank you. That really clarifies that for me. We have a question coming in that's related to the sort of status of the particular catalog. You were focusing on the Phangthangma catalog as well as the 2 previous ones. Is it possible, this audience member asks, that there were more imperial catalogs, but these are the only ones that were later mentioned or have later been found? What do you think?
Mm-hmm. Oh, absolutely. I mean, it is clear that, oh, well, where there were the 3 authoritative, let's say, official catalogs, but there must have been different inventories, because as we can see from the different categories, they were consulting different inventories, including Shonin Ningpo's inventory. So it seems that there were inventories of different collections of texts that eventually made it into the imperial catalog. I presume not all of them did. And I presume there might have been some sort of underground or unofficial translation activity going on as well. It seems from the number of texts that later were included. But I would say in terms of the Buddhist, the official catalogs, there are only 3. All Buddhist historians agree that those are the 3 main, with the Phangthangma being the last one. But I would imagine there are other inventories, yes.
And then on that note, this may be in reference to a later phase in the transmission of Buddhist texts in Tibet, but what was, this listener has asked, what are the criteria for choosing texts to include into the Kanjur and the Tenjur from these catalogs? You know, for instance, this listener mentions that some that got left out of major Kanjurs have been found in local ones. So did these catalogs shed light on what got included or excluded, for instance?
These are all very good questions. Of course, we don't have all the information we would like to. I would like to think that one of the criterion would have been, and it was for the later collections, is whether a Sanskrit manuscript could substantiate the translation, because I would imagine there's a lot of Tibetan authored works as well. We see that there was quite a lot of, the Tibetans were not just passive recipients of Indian Buddhism. They were actually at that early stage producing their own commentaries. Now, the question, of course, would arise is when they have a Tibetan text, how do they know, how would they ascertain if this is a translation of a Sanskrit text or if it was written by a Tibetan? And I think that became an important criterion later for Buddhism in compiling the Tibetan Buddhist canon. In other words, consulting, of course, older lists like the Phangthangma and the Dkar, and maybe the Tsinpuma, probably the Tsinpuma as well. It's now currently lost. So I think if it's found, that would probably be an extraordinary discovery, because then we can trace the whole development. But to answer the question, yes, I think whether they were able to produce a Sanskrit original would have been a determining factor of admitting a text into the canon. And
this is a sort of a question that I don't fully understand, but let me ask it to you anyways. How difficult, this listener writes, is discerning the looking back of the second transmission from the actual first transmission of the original transmission or translation of Indian texts? Does the question make sense to you?
I'm not sure exactly. I mean, it could be interpreted in different ways. That's why I'm not sure how different in which sense, in terms of the text that have been translated. Yeah, I mean, I can answer it from what I understand the question to mean that, well, there are a lot of texts that were translated during the second transmission of Buddhism, all the tantras, all the sarma schools, all the new schools, other literature is basically translations dating most of it to the second transmission. Then we have a very large collection of texts, the Enigma texts, which um, are said to be dating back to the empire. But then, of course, the challenge here is that we don't have any catalogs from that time to substantiate that claim. That doesn't mean that they do not, but it neither means that we can prove that they do. So there's a certain ambiguity. I mean, with the exception of texts that are included in the Phangthangma and Dharma catalogs, for other texts, we are not always sure. I mean, we have to look at the colophon of its text and see what kind of information we have as to when it was first translated. So there's a certain ambiguity. I wouldn't say we're certain. For some texts, we're absolutely certain. For others, it depends. We'll have to investigate.
And for the Phangthangma catalog itself, do you happen to know what percentage of the texts listed in there have made it into surviving Kanju and Tenjur today that people read and print and comment upon? It sounds like some of the texts were lost.
No. Yeah, no, nobody has done the study yet. I know there's been a study for the dkar, but not for the Phangthangma yet. So yes, there's quite a bit of work to be done. As far as I know, there's only two publications that have dealt with the Phangthangma. One was mine some time ago, and one by a Japanese scholar, Kagogawa. And since then, and that's why I think one of the reasons I wanted to give this talk today is to sensitize scholars how important this resource is, and I think it merits more studies to be done on it. Yes, for sure.
So speaking of some of the insights that you brought out about this catalog in terms of its historical dimensions and its doctrinal dimensions, I'm particularly curious about the intellectual history dimensions that it might shed light on. So for instance, how does its doxographical structure, or you also mentioned, say, in the case of dharanis, that they're separated by size, by kind, and then you use this term genera, which I'm not exactly sure what that means, but these are different ways in which the creators of this catalog sought to divide the text in different ways. Are the kinds of divisions that show up, say, in the Phangthangma catalog indicative of a particular kind of intellectual approach to categorizing texts that we don't, for instance, see later on in Tibet?
I think a lot of those categories, I mean, in terms of the divisions of sutras, for example, into Avatamsaka, Prajnaparamitas, we do see this kind of divisions in the Tibetan Buddhist canon, and also the division between sastras and sutras and tantras and dharani. So some have actually carried on, others didn't. Like, for example, you're right, pointing out the size, I think it's a fascinating time, because you probably have all these Tibetan translators with these Indian scholars, and they're trying to make sense of this like volumes of texts. I mean, Buddhism reached Tibet 1,000 years later since the Buddha's time. So we're having, basically 1,000 years development, and the Tibetans were extraordinary at being able to try to sort out all this, Buddhist literature, this Buddhist heritage, and put it into categories. And I mean, you can see, categories like genera, which means just generic texts. They couldn't really classify them as belonging to any particular category. So they says general. Or they have, they didn't know exactly where to place them. And they said, well, let's do it by size. And you can see they're struggling to find ways to understand it. And place it in categories that they could actually refer to in the future. And some, of course, died out. It didn't make any sense really to classify texts according to size. It seems quite arbitrary, but you can see already the early steps. And I think, probably this all happened in consultation with the Indian Panditas, which were actually trying to make some sense out of this vast Buddhist heritage.
This is absolutely amazing. This is all completely new to me. So I'm so glad that you've brought these issues to light in your talk, and I hope that it will inspire more people to do work on these catalogs. Something that again I found particularly striking was the inclusion of works that were still in the process of revision or that hadn't yet been finished being translated, etc. Is this a feature of, say, either the first imperial catalog or other non-imperial catalogs, other kinds of ways that texts may have been cataloged later on? Forgive me for my ignorance. I'm not sure if this genre of catalog of something that continued beyond the imperial period or not, but was there this category of things that are unfinished or unrevised, something that we see later on?
Those are very good questions, Trent. I wish I had the answer, because we do have a lot of gaps in our understanding of the process. But this sets light that certainly it wasn't arbitrary. They seem to have had different categories. So it went through different stages of revision, different stages of authorization. So it seems that those categories that we find in the Phangthangma are really fascinating in the sense that it shows us that they didn't just translate any text they received. They wanted, I think the question of authenticity was very important to them. And I think that's also probably to Indian Buddhist scholars, because I would imagine that they were, Indian Buddhist scholars that were writing up texts and attributing them to the Buddha. Just as Tibetans, just as Chinese, they've done it. And the question of, lineage and tracing texts back to the Buddha Vajana, I think it was a very important issue. And I think they must have struggled in the sense that they really needed to make sure that even though they have a Sanskrit text, is that Sanskrit text really an authentic Buddhist teaching, right? Just because it's written in Sanskrit, it didn't mean that it could have been written in Central Asia. It could have been written anywhere. It could have been written by anyone at the time. So I think those are questions that they try to come up with some criteria to make sure that what ends up in the canon, in the official catalog, is actually the words of the Buddha. Now, whether they succeeded in that enterprise or how accurate, I think they did their best with what they had at their disposal.
And it sounds like, different kinds of religious canons throughout history, these kinds of debates show up around, what is considered authentic, what can be included in the canon or not. And sometimes there's also been questions about, is a particular canon open or closed? So one listener has asked, does this particular catalog shed light on, say, with the inclusion of these indigenous Tibetan commentaries, does that say something about the relative status of open or closedness of the canon during this period?
Mm-hmm. That's a good question. It definitely seems to have been open, because probably the version we have dates to the 14th century. So it seems it was a work in progress. And how to understand the Tibetan Buddhist canon as open or closed? I would say, especially when it comes to the Nyingma canon, because there are more canons than just one. The Nyingma canon is open, and insofar as there is treasure literature that can, there's still the possibility of being revealed. I would say the canon is still an open canon, because Buddhist teachings have not reached an end. There can still be new teachings coming up, and I think that is quite clear. I think with the Nyingma canon, with the Kangyur and Tengyur, could there be new texts? It could be. They could be different. We have also various. It's very complicated because of the different Kangyurs. We don't have just one. We have many different lineages of kanjurs and tengyurs. So what is actually in it and what is considered, closed or definitive? I would say this is a question that cannot be really answered. I don't think there is a closed canon. Yeah.
So to think of another period of textual formation in Tibetan Buddhist history writ large, and to think maybe in a completely different region than where this Phangthangma uh, catalog in its original form would have been formulated, how was, say, for instance, in Dunhuang, was something like the middle treatise or the large treatise, was this important to that kind of interface between, say, Chinese and Tibetan texts, as well as other kinds of translation and study practices that were happening there? Or is that falling sort of outside of the region of this set of imperial decrees around how translation should work?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think the tight control was probably in Lhasa in the central Tibet. And that's where the imperial center was, and the Buddhist council. And so I think there it was very strict. And the more we moved to the borders, like Dunhuang, the borders of the empire, I think things were much more loose, very flexible. And probably there was no one to control that or other parts. So this really, in some sense, you're right, reflects really central Tibet and the texts that were translated under those guidelines. And then more you move outside, you see that the empire doesn't have the type of control that it has in the center.
And with thinking about the nature of that control as it would have operated in Lhasa, for instance, is there evidence in these catalogs, either in the Phangthangma one or the earliest one, or in some other kind of source, around how the overall list of what text should be in the canon was decided upon? In other words, one listener writes, was it more kind of just individual scholars working with Indian panditas and whatever text they happen to have ended up being translated? Or is there some kind of master plan in place to make sure that there was a comprehensive scope of Indian Buddhist literature being translated?
Yeah, those are wonderful questions coming in. I think the listener who actually commented on this is absolutely right, because a catalog can be studied not only for the text that it includes, but also for what it excludes. And a canon is just as much as about inclusion as it is about exclusion. And the question, what has been excluded and what has been included? Of course, we know there's a lot of texts that have been excluded. And I think that's also a very interesting study to look at the exclusion of texts from those proto-canons, proto-canonical collections. And the criteria, I think the Tibetans had to rely on Chinese scholars and Indian scholars, and from Kashmir, from Nepal, from China, as to what is canonical and what should be included. And I think they had to rely on scholars, Buddhist scholars, for those decisions. I mean, of course, you have Tibetans who also went to India. So that's very interesting. I think it's a very complex picture, and I think we don't fully have a grasp of this extraordinary endeavor. I mean, to have 1,000 texts standardized and translated during that time, at least 1,000 officially translated, and it's a large number of texts, and the expertise and the resources and the way they collated them and how many different copies they had, because I would imagine there were also different Sanskrit variants of a single text. How they went about it, those are all questions that we don't have an answer at present.
One thing that you mentioned and then a listener has asked about is why specifically were at this period tantric texts excluded, even though in this catalog it seems like because it had, it was, as you explained, it's kind of an open register. In other words, things were added maybe after some decrees were in effect. What were the reasons for the exclusion of, say, tantric texts in this context? I have a follow-up for that later, but maybe best to ask this question first.
Well, I mean, we see that definitely the imperial family, I mean, tantras have always been associated with power. And that kind of power, whether it's symbolic power, actual power, or you don't want it spread to everyone. You want to have some regulation as to who is going to have this kind of power. And tantric texts have always been about that. And we already see with the Vairocana cult that those texts circulated within the elite, and the elite wanted to have access to these texts and access to this power, and not necessarily disseminated to. And that's something that continued, I think, throughout the history of tantric literature. Vajrayana has never been really open to everyone. There has always been, up until today, certain restrictions for different reasons at every time. But so why they were restricted is a good question. I think because of that, because of the possibility of them being misunderstood on the one hand, because tantric texts require commentaries, require someone to explain the symbolism behind a lot of those texts written often what they say in twilight language. And so they can be misunderstood, they can be abused, and they also contain a lot of power that this was kept, under control.
And as a follow-up for that, if I may, it sounds like there was one marginal note that you mentioned that says the translator's colophons from the inner tantras are listed in other indices. In other words, somehow outside of this catalog. Are there any other marginal notes, other kinds of paratextual materials that are showing up in the catalog itself?
That's the only one I found, and I thought it was fascinating because it shows that the scribe knew about different catalogs, and so there must have been kept different catalogs at different places by different people, by different translation teams. I mean, Vajrayana teachings were circulated during the times of the empire, so we do know that. I don't think, and the claim of all the Nyingma tantras really dating back to the times of the imperium, I don't think it's something they made up. I'm sure there must have been different lineages, which maybe they were just not registered. I would assume, or outside Lhasa, outside central Tibet, outside, those are all very, very good questions. And I think we have more questions than answers when it comes to these catalogs.
If I can ask your time for just one more question that a listener has sent in, they've asked, thinking perhaps if there are texts in the Dhenkarma that are not included in the Phangthangma, is
Yes.
it possible that the Phangthangma was a catalog of a physical library rather than being an attempt to catalog all presently known translated texts?
Oh, yes, I think it absolutely was a library. It was the imperial library. And I think the catalog is just only cataloging the texts that were in the imperial library that have been translated. I mean, those were property of the emperor. I mean, we have to understand that Buddhism in Tibet wouldn't have taken place if it wasn't for the imperial support. So all these were imperial property, and all these registers and all these translator teams were sponsored by the emperor. I mean, this required a lot of financial resources. I mean, you can imagine the scribes, the buying of manuscripts, the translation, the revisions. So because the emperor, funded this enterprise, and of course, then all this was imperial property.
Again, this has been such an illuminating lecture, and then time for Q&A. I know I said that would be the last question, but I just wanted to highlight again how extraordinary this particular catalog is, and the manuscript of it. And I was also totally surprised that it sounds like you and one other scholar have published about it. And what hopes do you have, or what would you imagine would be especially fruitful for other scholars to pursue about this particular catalog? What methods, what approaches, what do you think would be the next logical step in research?
I think you mentioned it before yourself, looking at how many of those texts actually have made it into the Tibetan Buddhist canon. That would be important, trying to identify them, compare the Don Juan collections with these registers, do a lot of comparatives. A lot of it's textual work and philological work, but I think it can be very rewarding in helping us gain a better picture and more clear picture of how Buddhism was transmitted to Tibet. I think they're wonderful resources. A lot of people, when they think of catalogs, they think, oh, it's so boring. It's just a list of texts. And yes, that's what it is. They are a list of texts, really. It's a register. We don't have the actual text. A lot of them are lost, or maybe they're not lost. They're under a different title. That's another thing. And I think, this is what fascinated me when I started working on those catalogs, seeing that what wonderful resources they are and how much value they have. They're not just boring lists. They're actually telling us about just as much about Indian Buddhism at the time. And that's another thing that I think a lot of Indian Buddhist scholars maybe could also benefit by studying these catalogs, is to ascertain the kind of Buddhism that existed in India at the time. And it's just important for Tibetologists and Tibetanists, to learn about this extraordinary period in the history of Tibetan Buddhism.
So thank you so much. You've taken what could have been a boring list of texts looking in the outside and made it a completely compelling lecture and an engaging conversation. So thank you again, Professor Halkias, for sharing your time with us today and for preparing this wonderful talk. We really appreciate it.
Thank you, Trent, for being such an extraordinary host, not just for my lecture, but for all lectures of the Khyentse series. And of course, I'm most grateful for the Khyentse Foundation for this invitation, and to all listeners who made it up until the end. I hope it was worthwhile everyone's time. Thank you very much.
So thank you all again for joining us. I just wanted to announce that the next lecture in our series will be by Professor Li Shanghai, who's a professor of Buddhist studies at National Taiwan University. This will take place not in March, but in April, on Saturday, April 20th at 10 a.m. Taipei time, or that's 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, on Friday, April 19th. Professor Li's lecture will be in Chinese. It will be about the aesthetics of disgust in Sanskrit Buddhist literature. And like other Chinese language lectures in this series, it will be hosted by my wonderful colleague, Dr. Mingyuan Gao of the University of Hong Kong. So I hope some of you will be able to join us for that. As always, to stay in touch about upcoming events, visit our website, www.khyentsefoundation.org. Thank you again for joining us. We hope to see you again soon. May you all be safe and well.